So the recording is on, and we do this so that if people who couldn't come here today could also find the link to this journal club on the I-MDRC website. So, and if you're a member, of course, this is a good plug to be a member. If you're a member, you can access previous I-MDRC journal clubs. So today I would like to welcome you to our journal club. My name is Jane Clark, and I'm the moderator of the International Motor Development Research Consortium journal clubs. And as I always like to say, I've been in a journal club since I was a graduate student, which is, I won't even tell you how many years ago. And today we have the honor and the, I say it is a bit sad, but also celebratory session to pay tribute to the work of Michael Turvey as it relates to motor development. We're going to be taking up a paper that Jill Whitall and I wrote that appears in the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior. And we're lucky enough, as it is, to have as our special guest today the guest editor for this special issue that was in memory. So it's not just our papers that were in there, but a number of papers that pay tribute to the passing of Michael Turvey and his efforts and his contributions to the area of motor behavior. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to do a few screen surfing. I'm going to turn it over to Whitall Profeta, who was the guest editor of the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior. An excellent journal, I will say. Over to you, Victor. Unmute yourself.
Okay, Dr. Clark, can you hear me well and see the slide properly? Okay.
A little echoey, so a little closer to your microphone.
What about now? Is that better? Okay. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Clark and Dr. Whitall for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. My name is Whitall Profeta. I'm a professor at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais in Brazil. And I was a guest editor of the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior, a special issue in honor of Professor Michael Turvey. And I would like to share with you today a little bit of my experience with Dr. Turvey. So I would like this presentation two parts, this quick introduction. First, I will talk a little bit about my personal experience with Michael as a mentor. And the second part, I will talk a little bit, I will provide an overview of the papers that were published at the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior. Michael Turvey was a very special person. In my editorial, I could talk a little bit about him and how he was a tremendous researcher, outstanding speaker, astonished professor, and of course a dear friend of mine. And I was very lucky to have the opportunity to study with him. And,
Victor, we're still
yes.
having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay.
Ask him to try it without his headphones. Can you talk without your headphone on?
How's that better?
Yes, I think that's a bit better. What do we think?
Is it better?
Yes, can you bring your volume up just a little bit more?
Okay. How about now?
That's better, I think.
Good?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. So I was very lucky to have the opportunity to study with Michael Turvey because he was always very generous. He was listening to my ideas and demonstrating curiosity about the discoveries that I was making. And I believe all Michael students would remember him saying, making discoveries, asking us all the time that he was reading us. And to me, Michael Turvey was an example of how to do science and how to foster students' talents. And of course, when we talk about Michael Turvey, we also have to talk about Claudia Corello, who was my PhD advisor. Claudia was the long-life partner of Michael Turvey and a brilliant researcher herself. When I first heard about Michael Turvey, I was an undergrad student. A friend of mine attended to a conference that we had at my university, and Michael was the key speaker. And my friend was saying a lot of good things about Michael Turvey, but I really didn't appreciate what my friend was saying. But then when I started to get involved with motor learning and I did my master thesis, Michael Turvey was one of the main readings that I had. But again, I haven't met him yet. But I was lucky again to have the ICPA, the International Conference of Perception and Action in Ouro Preto, being hosted in Ouro Preto, a city nearby my city. So there I could meet him and Claudia Corello, and I told them that I was about to go to the US for the Motor Control Conference in Cincinnati. And I asked them if I could go and visit them in CESPA. They said okay, and Claudia managed for me to be there on Friday so I could enjoy their pub. Then I went to the US, I landed in New York, I took a bus to Yukon stores, and there I would visit CESPA for an afternoon, and Claudia showed me the facilities and everything else. And then by the end of that, they have me in their house. I was studying a book that Michael lent me to study while he was working, and at night I had a pub time at Sweet Williams, the pub that they had in their basement, and I could share some ideas with him. By that time, my English was still really poor. I was still learning English by that time. But Michael stayed with me until 3 a.m. discussing things about science and listening to my ideas. But I think that started to show a little bit how Michael was behind the scenes. Not only Michael Turvey, the brilliant researcher and the outstanding speaker that most people have seen, but also how he really cared about students and younger people that was entering the field. And I would like to share another bit of experience that I had with him, but more formal experience. That was the class that I took with him, the teaching course. Michael Turvey was awarded more than once for his teaching skills. And this course, he designed the course just for grad students. That we need to give students the opportunity to learn things, and we need to be redundant in this process to help them to find a way to understand what we're saying. Another lesson that he was always teaching us, do not assume too much. That is, if you have a key concept that you need something that is basic to explain it, don't assume that the students know the basics. Explain the basics and go to the key concept. Don't assume too much. And another point that is still keep with me, every single class he was saying, use the stupid diagrams. And please, stupid here in the sense that you have to facilitate students to understand what you're saying. Sometimes very colorful and beautiful pictures are nice to show, but they make understanding much harder. So make it easier. That sense that he was saying the stupid diagrams. And I still spend a lot of time in my classes trying to organize those stupid diagrams to help my students. And to give you a sense of how dedicated Michael Turvey was with this teaching course, I would like to show you a little bit of the structure of that course. For example, the first class was the 5-minute talk. We could choose any subject, and we had 5 minutes to talk about it. And Michael Turvey was evaluating us in terms of the control of language and the deep appreciation of time. So how can we better use language to say about something that's sometimes not that easy, but in a very short period of time, 5 minutes? How can you use the best time that we have and the best language that we can to better express what we want? After that, we start to do syllabus and organize all the content of the course. For example, a course in motor learning or motor development. And then we start to teach to him. The first class that I actually taught to him was a 5-minute class on a chalkboard. I had to draw things and explain things and display information, and he was evaluating. That 5-minute presentation or lecture took me more than 50 minutes with him, because he was stopping me every 15 seconds, saying what I should do different and how I could improve, how I should move on the room, and helping me to understand every single bit of what the lecture means. Once I passed that, we then have 2 panels of that chalkboard, and then 10 minutes to do the same. And then we go to 3 panels and 50 minutes until we get half hour or 50 minutes, a lecture of 50 minutes. Once we understood that, how to draw things on the board, how to write things on the board and control the time between writing and connecting with the class again, he allowed us to start to use slides. And the technique of building and creating those slides was basically the same that we learned with a chalkboard. So displaying things slowly, using animations and all of that, transferring the skills that we learn in the very analogic settings to that digital settings. However, once in the semester, without previously warning us, Michael would say, okay, you prepared your class of 50 minutes on slides, but today the projector is broken. You cannot use it. So how are you going to do it? Because in small universities, those things happen. You don't have the ideal material to do your classes. So how are you going to handle that? Back to chalkboards and using the idea of slides to keep doing your class besides the non-optimal conditions. Besides that, Michael was also concerned with the space of a class. For example, we start with small classrooms, like about 20 people, and use that room and learning how to walk around it until we get big rooms like 200 plus people and learning how to use the stairs to grab people's attention and better explain and deliver our message. Of course, that's just a short summary of what was the course, but that I feel that gives you the glimpse of how dedicated Michael Turvey was to help his students to be better teachers. And it's another point that I didn't say yet. By that time, Michael Turvey was already retired. So he went back to stores, to the program, just to teach us about how to be a better teacher in his concepts. So maybe people may be thinking then why Michael Turvey was so concerned about his students' teaching skills, because again, he was already retired. And the answer is because he deeply believed that teaching would be the bread and butter of most of the students. Not all students could succeed in science and research, but most of them could do that in teaching. And that's why he was always concerned about preparing people to be better teachers. I believe that gives, as I said, a little bit of information about how Michael Turvey was. The last time that I saw him in person was a week after my dissertation defense, and I had the opportunity to see him again online when he turned 80. By that time, I kept exchanging messages with him and Claudia, and then last year, Claudia started to send us the messages saying that Michael's health was not doing well. And then on August 30th, Claudia sent us the sad update saying that Michael had passed in the previous night. I sent her a message saying that I couldn't go, I just had a kid, and also to take an American visa since mine had expired would take 6 months by that time, so I would not be able to do it. But I felt that I should be able to do something. And then I contacted Fabio Barbieri, the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Journal of Model Behavior, and asked him if we could publish a special number in honor of Michael Turvey, and he promptly said, okay, let's try to do that, find the people and I will help you. Well, then I did what all former grad students do. I sent a message to my advisor and asked her, could you send me, I have a list of people that I believe that they would be great contributing for our special issue, but I would like that you make sure that I have all important names here. Could you send me a list that you believe that would be important to keep their names? She sent me a list of scholars that Michael and Claudia enjoyed during the conferences. And then Scott Kels, Mark Latache, Anatole Feldman, David Rosenbaum, Jill Whitall, and Jane Clark accepted my invitation and they wrote the paper for this special issue. And also I invited some former CESP students, Ramesh Balasubramaniam, Nia Amazin, Paula Silva, and Jeff Wagner. I would like to give you now an overview of their papers, and maybe you get interest to read that papers because there are a lot of nice stuff, interesting stuff there. So on More Time with Feeling, a personal tribute to Michael Turvey, the scientist, Scott Kels transcribed his eulogy that he delivered in Michael's funeral. And he provides a lot of interesting details about their relationship and also making strong statements about how Michael Turvey helped to create many different fields in science. In the mini review, Biological Movement as Objects of Natural Science, Mark Latache provides a review, a very complete, although short review about strategies to think movements in terms of natural science, in particular the UCM analysis for synergies and the equilibrium point hypothesis, ideas that Michael Turvey shared in terms of how to approach the problems of biological movements. And biological movements as objects of natural science, Anatol Feldman shares with us an interesting detail. Feldman is well known by the equilibrium point hypothesis, which he started to publish in the mid-60s. And then in 1995, he published an extension of that perspective with Levin, which was the referent control approach of perception and action, which is well explained in his book of 2015. But Feldman shares with us that the idea of expanding the original equilibrium point hypothesis was Michael Turvey's suggestion to him, and he took that serious and expanded his theory. Michael Turvey, a personal tribute, David Rosenbaum, gives us a very, very interesting historical review of the field, including how much Michael Turvey contributed with his own research program, and gives us an example of how his research was influenced by Michael Turvey ideas. And the organization of action, contemporary relevance of Turvey's approach to motor behavior. Ramesh Balasubramanian, who was a CESPA student and Michael student in the 90s, gives us an extension of the program that he started back 20, 30 years ago, with now new technology and some new mathematical tools. Modern science assistance approach inspired by Michael Turvey. Nia Amazon shows us how Michael and Claudia used to think about their students beyond the academic dimension. She shared with us their perspective of students as a complex system themselves, and they try to take care of every single dimension of their students, the social dimension, the financial dimension, helping students to be better and do their best in the academic. Faraday's Error of Omission, a tribute to Michael Turvey by Jeffrey Wagman, is a very smart and clever paper in which Wagman uses one of 5 favorites Michael scholars, Faraday's. And Michael had the Faraday's admonition to scientists, which is work, finish, and publish. And Wagman takes this and expands it as well, saying that from Michael Turvey's perspective, yes, we need to work, finish, publish, but also teach and celebrate the things that we do. Remembering Michael Turvey, a tribute to extraordinary teacher and mentor by my dear friend Paula Silva. She gives us an example of how Michael was as a mentor and as a teacher, using the action course, one of the most famous courses of Michael Turvey, as a reference for that, and how he treated very respectfully every single theory that was in the field, including those that he disagreed completely. And she was very impressed by that attitude. And last but not least, we have Jean Whitall and Jane Clark will interview reflection on the impact of Professor Michael Turvey on motor development. I will not give you much details about this paper, but it's a fantastic review that I recommend everybody to read, because Dr. Whitall will do that better than me now. So to finish, again, I would like to thank you for having me here today. And of course, I would like to thank Dr. Turvey for everything that he did for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Vitor. We'll take all the questions at the very end. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box for people to think about later. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to come on first, and then let's make sure I'm getting the right one here. Okay, so thank you for that introduction and for your personal stories about Michael Turvey. As a person who also believes very strongly in the role of teaching in being a researcher and a scientist, your story is wonderful. And the fact that Michael spent time actually teaching you to be teachers is heartening, actually. Okay, so in the paper that when Vitor asked us to do this paper, we immediately said yes, because I think many of us don't really appreciate the impact that Turvey had on motor development. He's generally considered a motor control, a motor behavior person, and not so much really anyone who had done anything in the area of motor development. So what we want to do is highlight the scientific scope of Turvey's impact on motor development, and then expose you as readers to papers that they may not have read, and which today still may shed important light on the problems that we're still trying to do. Our approach was a little bit different than some of the others. It's not actually a meta-analysis or anything like that. It's really a subjective and an historical narrative, and probably historical because I'm just old. What can I say? And I'm going to start by a little historical story. It turns out that at the University of Wisconsin at the same time, Scott Kelso and I were in graduate school at the same time, and that is where we had our first journal clubs. Okay, it's 1976. Yes, we're very old. And that's when we started the first journal club. And today, at this point in my career, I'm still doing journal club and I still love it. And interestingly enough, from the University of Wisconsin, the University of Iowa, the year before I graduated with my PhD, Scott Kelso was hired at the University of Iowa. And in those days, we were hired into a department of physical education for men and a department of physical education for women. And the picture I have here to the left is, Iowa is a beautiful campus, but more importantly, the two departments were on either side of the river. So on one side of the river was the men's physical education department, and on the other side was the women's physical education department. And Scott and I had this sort of goal of trying to bring these two departments together, because in graduate school at Wisconsin, the two men's and women's departments were merged, even though they had two separate undergraduate programs. When Kelso got there, he had this idea to apply for an NSF loci grant, which actually was a grant from NSF to improve local undergraduate teaching. We also, at that time, the CIC, which is the Big Ten, they had this Committee on Institutional Cooperation. They had created these conferences that took up different ideas. And we decided we would apply for one on motor development, because at that time, it seemed like a really good idea. And of course, we're the young Turks. We're just starting our careers. We're definitely going to do something to impact our field. So out of what we did were two books. One on the left, which is the Human Movement Behavior, that was the result of the loci grant that was given in 1978. What the loci grant did was it brought basically motor learning control faculty to the campus to teach the undergraduate classes. And just as Victoria was just telling us about what a great teacher was, 5 different lectures by Michael Turvey, all right, in that loci grant, coming to campus, actually teaching the undergraduate students. So these undergraduate students were in this class in which these people were coming in to teach their class. And out of that then came this final book. In 1979, both Scott, actually 1970 to 76, Scott and I were both in Iowa City. And in 1979, we had both left. But the CIC grant came in for the 79. So we came back for the conference that was hosted at the University of Iowa. And I want to make a note here that both departments of men and women's physical education actually contributed considerable amount of money to the funding and the administration of both these grants. But out of these two, which were both mandated in a sense by the grants themselves, were two publications. Okay, so this is what I think Victoria was saying, is that this is a perfect example of the way in which Turvey does his teaching. So he has this figure, probably wasn't, it might have been even drawn on the blackboard when he was teaching it. But this was what was going on in motor behavior in general, was that everything was about a motor program. And it was as if you had 1,000 million motor programs and you just pulled them out and they played off on a keyboard. And so that was kind of the metaphor. So he introduces us to Bernstein's ideas. And this, I think, is really important because most people cite it as Bernstein's ideas, which they were, but it was Michael Turvey that opens up Bernstein to us. He's the one who tells us about the problems of degrees of freedom and context condition variability, about the idea of coordinative structures. This is something that I don't think we all appreciate until you go back and you look at these chapters, which were co-authored with other members of his group that were in this loci grant. So this is the grant that was the teaching of undergraduate courses. And I use these 3 chapters teaching my undergraduate motor development class. But just as I sort of fault everyone else, I rarely said that it was because of Turvey, but we always talked about them as Bernstein's problems. And then, sorry about the crookedness of this slide, but this chapter was the first chapter in the edited book that Kelso and I did. At the time in motor development, if you go back and look at the history of it, there were two paradigms that were coexisting. One was on sort of information processing. It was schemes, plans, programs, basically an information processing approach. On the other side, with the descriptive approach, how you threw a ball, what the patterns of coordination look like. If you've ever seen Wickstrom's book, it epitomizes this sort of program. And so at the beginning of the book is a chapter from page 5 to page 78. And I challenge you to read this chapter today. Even today, it is an intensely difficult paper to unpack. And it is both Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey who write this paper together. And it's, you know, I remember we had a meeting once just amongst a bunch of faculty in motor development to read this paper together and try to unpack and understand what it was all about. But again, this was Michael Turvey on the control and coordination of naturally developing systems. Okay, he's talking about development here. Okay. And so at this point, I'm going to turn the rest of this talk over to my colleague and co-author, Jill Whitall. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you, Jill, are... Oh, I want to make one more point before I switch over. If you haven't been to the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior, go there. It is an open access journal, and it is, you know, there's a number of wonderful papers in there, including all the ones from this special issue. But you can go there, and it's not behind a paywall. It's right there. All you do is Google Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior. Okay, Jill, over to you. Unmute yourself and share your screen.
Okay.
We're not seeing your screen yet.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to share and put it onto. Okay. I presume everybody can hear me. And
Yes.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Whitall. And now I feel like one of Turvey's students, because I got far less time to do my do my slides than I was anticipating. But nevertheless, I will continue. So we divided our paper. And by the way, Jane is correct that it's hard to read the Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey paper. It was as a student. It's a little bit easier now, but it was also hard to write this this paper. And what we decided to do was to divide it into two parts. The first part was really the growth of the dynamic systems and ecological realism paradigms, which we've started at 1975 up to 1999. And then part two is just motor development at the start of the 21st century. And the reason we made that cut, not because it divides into two nice, easy 25-year periods, but because in a paper that we've written with a number of other people, we came to the conclusion that the sort of peak, perhaps, of the influence of Michael Turvey on motor development might have been around about 2000. We can argue about that later. So let's carry on. Everybody stands on the shoulders of giants, and you probably recognize or may recognize these two people. This is James Gibson, James Gibson, and this is Nikolai Bernstein. And throughout the chapter, the three guys, which is Kugler, we couldn't find a picture of him, Scott Kelso, and Michael Turvey, they constantly referred to standing on the shoulders of these two eminent scientists. Now, the second caveat we have, so that's the first caveat. The second caveat we made at the beginning of the paper was, well, how do you distinguish between Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey when you're reading the chapter? And after quite a bit of consideration and reading around, we've decided that, in fact, probably Turvey is at the bottom of this pyramid, because he started his work way before 1982, which will become apparent a bit later. And I'm very sorry that there's a gardening event happening. I hope you can still hear me. So here's the paper that Jane was introducing. And one of the ways, well, of course, one of the ways you're going to say somebody is influential is if people cite you, or, you know, so citations are a sort of quantitative sense of impact. So we decided to look, well, who in this first conference was actually citing any of Turvey's work? And one person was Mike Wade, who we all know, in a timing paper, which he was actually, which he'd actually done from an information processing point of view. Second person was Jane Clark, who was also into information processing, and she was talking about response mechanisms. Both of them brought in this new paradigm. And the third person, you might guess, was Carl Newell, and he was doing a theory paper, but this particular theory paper is not exactly well cited compared to some of his previous, so his subsequent. So counting, if you do a count, out of the other 12 papers, other than the one that Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey did, only 3 of them directly referenced Turvey at all. So we looked at the citations, we looked at what they wrote, and we looked at the citations, and they were definitely clearly influenced by him, if not fully following him at that time. So the next conference we looked at where researchers in motor development were gathered together, this time from all around the world. And this was a conference in Maastricht, in the Netherlands. And there were 2 books that came out of this conference. And one of them had the famous Carl Newell constraints triangle displayed for more or less the first time. And the other person who I want to mention here is, of course, Esther Thielen, and her paper in this particular book was about rate limiters, but she had already started to use Turvey's ideas as well as Kelso's and Kugler's before this, but this is a paper that she's well known for. And another person who you might be surprised, who's in the Themes of Motor Development book, you might be surprised I pick him, but his name is Walt Davis. So some of you will know him. And he did a lovely paper with Kelso about looking at the difference between coordination and control. And I'm not going to explain any of these concepts now because I really don't have time. But what our purpose was is to look again how many papers there were and how many were referencing Turvey. And we found that 16 out of the 45, which is 36%, so this is a bit more than the 25% we had before, directly referenced Turvey's work. Now I'm going to have a quick digression. Oh, and sorry, and here are some of the other authors. So you might be interested, people who are particularly, who remember some of these people. These are the authors that we noted, in addition to people like Clark and Wade, who we've mentioned before. These are other people that did mention this new paradigm. So here's my digression. This is Walt Davis, an older picture of him. This is Alan Burton, who some of you may remember. This is I could not find, well, there is no older picture of Alan Burton, of course. So I just want to say that they were so influenced by this whole new paradigm, the ecological side of it, and the sort of, so the Gibsonian side of it and the Bernsteinian side of it, that they came up with something called an ecological task analysis. And to my mind, this really is better than the previous motor development task analyses that were out there, which were also good, but this is, I think, is wonderful. So I'm just going to mention it and say that it applies to both instruction and assessment, and I think it's worth a look at. So that's all I'm going to say there. So let's go back to our main task. So we wanted to make a point about the fact that Newell's paper on constraints and Thielen's paper on rate limiters, as well as several other papers she did, including a conceptual paper with Kelso and Fogel that we also referenced. These papers became so dominant in the field of motor development that we would call them indirect influences. So often people might, and Jane was referring to this earlier, often people might mention Newell without really, and his constraints, without realizing that Newell has emphasized or referred to Turvey's work, and the same with Thielen. So we think that we think of Newell and Thielen, and then there probably are others, but these are really two big indirect influences and reflectors of the impact of Turvey, Michael Turvey. So we found a third book. Also, I forgot to mention that these were, I think, NATO sponsored conferences. And this one was specific to infancy and early childhood and included quite a few psychologists and less, I would say, less from the kinesiology world. One of the psychologists that we thought was worth mentioning from this book is, and maybe some people recognize him, it's Gene Goldfield. And he was asked at this conference to comment on another paper. And then he commented on the other paper, but then he got to talk about what he thought were really key concepts from this dynamic systems ecological realism paradigm. So brain behavior, flexibility and stability and emergent functions. And we mention it because it really is a good paper to read. It's very accessible, probably more accessible than the 82 paper of Kugler, Kelsen, and Turvey. So again, we did our counting here, and there were 13 out of 34, which is 38%, sort of more or less something that similarly to the previous, so directly or indirectly referenced Turvey. And again, here are some of the names that you might recognize. A lot of these people are in fact psychologists, and I would argue that at this particular point in time, there was a raging debate between information processing and dynamic systems in particular, as well as ecological approaches. And I think because there are so many psychologists, as opposed to some kinesiologists, that we don't have a higher number here, because a lot of the papers in this book actually compared the two theoretical conceptions directly. Okay, so, and if you look through, Woolacott is not really known for being a dynamic systems or ecological person, but she did do a good effort in this particular book. And a couple of other people were a bit more critical of the dynamic systems and ecological realism. But they mentioned them, so they acknowledged them. And one more in this era, I talked to Michael Turvey a few times, and I always asked him, well, why don't you do studies on children? And he said, oh, no, they're much too complicated. So this, to my knowledge, is only the second time he did, this is a conceptual paper on development, and it's the only other time that I could find specifically. And this is worth reading because it really does go into some fundamental concepts from this way of looking at things, and that can be tested today. It's just a good book chapter in a book. It's actually a commentary on a load of other people's, but like most people who do commentaries, just as I mentioned earlier, they took, and this is, by the way, is Paula Fitzpatrick, who's kind of gone out of the field of motor development, but she was in it for a while. This is, it gives a lot of ideas, let's put it that way. So. But it only has 168 citations. So this, I want to make the point, is very low for Michael Turvey, and it reflects the fact that not enough people are looking at the book, looking at this paper and thinking about some of the ideas in it, in my or our humble opinion, I should say. So let's summarize part one. We're saying that his influence grew both directly and indirectly, At this time, by 2000, there are a lot of textbooks, all included sections on this kind of new paradigm. Some of the other motor development researchers who might be well known for trying to follow this idea are listed here, and there are many, many more. So I apologize if I've left out, well, we have left out a lot of people, but we couldn't keep on going. But round about 2000, as described in our chapter with these other authors, we thought there are things that are sort of acting against more and more people taking on this kind of mantle. And two of the reasons we gave in the paper, one were the untimely death of both Esther Thielen and Alan Burton. And although we didn't mention it in the paper, we've thought about it since, and there are people who've retired, and there are people who've repurposed their lives, maybe going into administration or maybe going into a different area than motor development. So I think that's also had some contributing factor. But the big ones we put in our paper was there was a US governmental emphasis on the brain and on health. These are two separate things, which have redirected the attention of a lot of motor development researchers to either understanding neuroscience and the sort of underlying neuromotor mechanisms, or have concerned with obesity and being physically active and physically competent. So that's, I think, taken away a lot of people who might have been more following directly what Michael Turvey and others have said. However, there is evidence, we think, of Turvey's continuing influence. And this, obviously, you already know, is his wife, Carella. And she usually accompanied him to conferences like at NASPA. So he was the keynote speaker for the motor development section at NASPA. There are a number of motor development researchers still applying these kind of principles, but maybe in a broader fashion to include all systems like cognition. Well, cognition is part of movement anyway, but sort of intellectual cognition, linguistics, and so on, emotions. And I just give the three obvious examples here, but I'm sure there are many more. Karen Adolph, David Anderson, and Daniela Corbetta. When you get older, you have these moments. And then there's also what we've noticed, again, being at NASPA so often, there's a widespread sort of citation of Newell's constraints model as a conceptual framework. And this comes from researchers from both motor development, from both what we would call a developmental motor neuroscience perspective, and from a developmental health perspective. And I can say why, I can say that with confidence later on. So we also thought, well, hang on, let's, are there people really still doing the kind of work that Turvey inspired, which we might call pockets of indirect influence, because they've gone on from, or gone away slightly, but still are in that kind of Bernsteinian, Gibsonian framework. And here are some that we thought of. This is Gregor Schoner, who, along with Mark Latache and John Schultz, who also had an untimely death, came up with the uncontrolled manifold hypothesis, where differentiating good and bad variability is key, and you might want to know when good overtakes bad in a developmental sense. And there are very few papers with children or that take a developmental angle at it. Jane and I actually wrote one, but we never got it published. We didn't even submit it, actually. But I did find one, and that's referenced in the book. Actually, there's more than one. I shouldn't say that. And then this is Nick Sturgio, and he did. He went along the non-linear analysis of variability, sort of mathematical viewpoint, where you should consider the temporal structure of how the variability occurs. and you can get more information that way. He did work for a long time with Reggie Harborn, and that was on children with and without clinical disorders. And Reggie actually used to come to NASPA quite regularly, but hasn't for a while. And we have two more pockets of indirect influence. And these, by the way, all started, this uncontrolled manifold hypothesis started around the 2000 mark, and so did Nick, just after 2000. Then we have, on the left is Keith Davids, who is, who we don't really know so well in America, but he's better known in Europe, I think, and in Australia and New Zealand. And his whole approach is, and this is directly from him, ecological dynamics approach to skill acquisition oriented toward education and sport contexts. So, but like the two previous pockets of influence, he doesn't directly look at motor development, and neither, as I mentioned earlier, do Gregor Schoner or Nick Sturgio. But it's possible that they might do work with other researchers who want to use their approach in a motor development context. At any rate, he's education and sports context. And then, of course, the fourth pocket of influence is perhaps the biggest one from my perspective, and that's Carl Newell, who's still going on. He'd had a lovely conceptual paper on timescales in motor learning and development. He used that conceptual framework to reinterpret the infant landscape metaphor that Phelan used to use. So he really, I think that's a fantastic paper. And then, believe it or not, he's also looking at teaching games through guided discovery and reinterpreting that through a constraints perspective. And again, these are things that might be, these are papers, I should say, that might be of interest to current motor development researchers, particularly those interested in physical education and getting children to be physically competent. Okay, so let's look at evidence of Turvey's direct influence. This is a picture of Michael Turvey. I have no idea how old he was there, but he looks to be about 20 or something. He was, if you didn't know this, he was an Olympic level athlete in the triple jump. He got injured, or he would have been on the Olympic team for Britain. So he did come from a sports background. So, but he's not done anything on children, as I mentioned earlier. However, in this period, he started, some of his students who lead the experiments had been looking at fundamental motor skills, which of course motor development people are very interested in, like galloping. I once approached Turvey at a conference when he was extolling to other people how there are only two stable states of in-phase and anti-phase phasing, so 0 to 30, 360 or 90, 180. And I went up to him and said, well, what about galloping? And he had no clue what I was talking about at the time. But later on, he studied galloping. He's looked at grasping, he's looked at quiet standing. I think there are probably others. But as I said earlier, these are all mostly either using theoretical models or adults as subjects. He doesn't look at children. But this is a very interesting paper, The Potential of Information and Affordances for Sport Skills. And again, he has a sports background. So there are two other reflective papers by Turvey that I found that I loved both of them. One was called Physical Education to Physical Intelligence, 50 Years of Perception Actions. This goes from his actual time back as an undergraduate, or at least some of the questions he had as an undergraduate at Loughborough. And then Ecological Perspective on Perception Action, what kind of science does it entail? And this is wonderful, again, for showing you what kinds of experiments can be done or should be done. Well, we'll say can be done. Okay, I think I'm doing okay this time. Yes, good. So I'm not going to answer the question of whether we showed that he has that his influence has really grown and then maybe waned a little bit, because we don't like the term waned, and we think that there is, there's still scope and there's still a lot of influence or impact of Michael Turvey going on today. And here are just 4 of the, and I've already mentioned several other papers that I think people should look at, but here are 4 more. This is one of his earliest ones, which was actually published initially in 1975, which is why we termed our first half of our part 1 from 1975 and not from 1982, which is sort of a bit of an error, I suppose, in our thinking now. But then Goldfield's one I mentioned already, and here are the 2 from Newell that I think everybody should read who's in motor development. So I want you to look at these 2, what are they called? Stupid diagrams. Well, one's a diagram, one's a photo. This one, if you don't know anything about Michael Turvey's love of his football life, this is the Gunners. This is the signal of the Gunners. It's a gunner, obviously, because this is a gun. And this is Arsenal, the best team, the best football team in the whole planet, Arsenal. And don't ask me why, but it is. So we had lots of chats about Arsenal. And then this, you recognize what it is, but it's a beer. What kind of beer is it? It's a beer used, or at least given at the Sweet William's pub. And here is Michael drinking a beer, although that doesn't look like his pub. But I just wanted to say, this is what he and I talked a lot about, beer and Arsenal, as well as science. So cheers to Michael Turvey. And then I've been told to remind you that from the 5th to the 8th of June, there's a double conference going on. So the Developmental Coordination Disorder Conference and the International Motor Development Research, what's the C? Consortium still. Those are both on at the same time in Ghent, which is a lovely city, and I'll be there. So I hope to see many of you there. 5th to the 8th of June this year. And that's, I think, the end of I can stop sharing. So I will stop sharing. Jane, back to you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone. Looks like we've lost those who might absolutely have been in class, but not the University of Michigan class is still here with us. Questions, you can either raise your hand or just put your questions in the chat box, whatever works for you. It's probably a lot to take in. You should read the papers. There's a lot there to unpack, obviously. And when you finished reading Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey, send me an email and tell me what it really was talking about. Okay, questions? Yes, that was Kip's class that had to nip out. Thank you, Kip. Questions? Well, we must have been so thorough that it was just okay. I have a number of people who are not
Jane,
adjusting
can I just
to
jump
our.
in and say something?
I was just going to make a comment. We've just had a couple of people join us. Oops, I'm sorry, but we're on daylight savings times in the US. So oops. David, to you, who got a citation in there, David.
Yeah, thanks. Wasn't expecting that. No, that was fabulous. I haven't actually read the paper yet, but I do plan to read all of them. But I was going to say, one person that I think often gets sort of neglected in terms of sort of carrying on the Turvey legacy from a motor development perspective is Audrey Vandermeer. Audrey's obviously worked, a lot with David Lee, and she's doing more neuroscience related stuff, but she's clearly a motor development person. And I know that her work is heavily heavily inspired by Turvey's work too. So we just wanted to throw that out, that I think she's a really good example of somebody who's sort of carried the Turvey torch and still talks a lot about him, references him a lot, and is sort of still pushing that agenda, even though it's a bit more neuroscience oriented than the other motor development stuff we're familiar with.
Well, that's, if you could put in the chat box any citation to something to get us started on that. So for other people, and because remember the chat gets attached to the
Yeah, I'll put Audrey's name in there, and then
That's great.
I'll dig something up.
And David Lee, you're right. David Lee would be another one who you don't see the direct connection, but obviously you have that same kind of ecological approach to things. So yeah. Jill's going, oh yeah, David Lee.
Yeah,
So-
where were you, Dave?
So I was going to make a
Got
point
you.
for those young people that one of the things that happened in our career, there weren't so many journals. I mean, there were very few journals to publish in, but these conferences that ended up with books. So the one that Jill alluded to is the NATO. I mean, really, NATO sponsored an Advanced Study Institute on Infant Development, which was the Henriette Block and Bertenthal book. What did NATO think we were building future military or something? I have no idea, but they sponsored these advanced study institutes, and there were just a ton of books. If you go to the library, you'll find a whole series of them, if you ever go to the library, that were done in the advanced psychology. There was a whole other group too, attention performance 1 to 14 or something like that were done, and then the advanced study institutes and so on. And so we used chapters and books a lot more than we did at the time, and they were good collections of things to have as a repository of science. Anybody else? Oh, come on. Michigan, you must have a question, or hey, read all the papers and you've got a critique of them, or
We don't have any questions, Jane. We were just soaking it all in today. I mean, I think it was really lovely to have the historical perspective. And as Kip said in the chat, to hear personal stories and things is always nice, especially for these folks as they're coming up in the field and, you know, maybe don't have as much exposure to how we got to where we are now. So thank you all for sharing that.
well, I think the other thing, when we went to COVID, so many of your new doctoral students and so on, you don't go to conferences much. And one of the ways that you share a beer afterwards, and that's how you get to know someone or someone. I think Vitor was telling me that I came up one time and critiqued his paper at a conference. He says, I remember exactly what you said to me. And I'm going, I did. But I think we missed that when we don't go to conferences anymore, or don't go as often as we did. So
I agree. And I think, one of the aspects of that too that's maybe missing and important is understanding academic lineage and theoretical framework lineage, and how sort of ideas evolve within groups of particular people and how we're all connected. It really is a relatively small field, if we sort of go back to the root of where these ideas came from, which is a neat thing to trace backwards.
Well, and how we evolved over our thinking. I mean, I was studying with Lola Halverson. Okay, we're talking throwing. Everybody in the lab was studying throwing. And I'm doing information processing reaction time. I couldn't even get somebody to build me a reaction time device. I had to go out and go across to the psych department and figure it out. And Halverson's only comment to me was interesting. Interesting, which is a good comment for an advisor to say about a student's work. Interesting. But I also think that then, Kelso also, if you look back at his original work, and then all of a sudden we get this group of people who just get hit by Turvey-esque kinds of ideas, and Gibson and Bernstein. And it's like, really, and I would challenge everybody to read Bernstein in the raw. I mean, in the real work, because most of my students, I used to have it on my shelf in my office from the library, and my students would always cite it, and I go, you couldn't cite it. I have the book right here from the library. So, but yes, it is. We all stand on the shoulders of those before us, and we just need to understand where we come from to better understand it, and also go back and read the original papers. Do not just read the summary of some, like us, just go back, every paper that Jill's talked about, go back and read those papers. Yeah, that'll give you your summertime reading. Any other comments, questions? Wonderful. I forgot to stop. Usually we don't do a recording through the questions and
It's
answers.
okay. I've just popped a question to the chat, but I might read it out. In terms of, I really liked the comment about ecological task analysis, and that being just this really nice framework, whether for instructors, teachers, coaches, physiotherapists. It's something that's actually a really nice, really accessible approach. And I just wondered, when you were going through this historical kind of retrospective and seeing all these other ideas from decades and decades ago in some cases, was there anything else that stood out to anyone as being, well, that's another forgotten gem, or something that hasn't gotten the attention that perhaps it deserved at any stage through? Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating listening in.
Thank you. Jill, I'll ask you to comment, unmute yourself.
Well, that was one of the first things that I thought about, because I went back and I remember their work and everything, and I went back and looked at the paper, and they immediately discussed Turvey, you know, and allude to him. So I thought, great, I want to make sure I highlight that work. And unfortunately, Walt Davis sort of moved away from the field, but he did contact us after somebody must have told him we cited him in this book chapter. I'm trying to think of other.
I will give you a
can't think-
citation that wasn't there, but everyone should remember Alan Burton's comment about galloping and skipping. He called them the happy gaits. The happy gaits. So whenever you see a child galloping or skipping, it's because they're happy. He called them he had some great lines like that. It was sad when we lost Tim very early in his career.
He was a great loss. Yeah. I'll have to think about that, Philip. So
Good question. Well, I think the other comment I would say to everyone, especially those who are professors as well as future professors, was Turvey's emphasis on teaching. We actually had a course at Maryland that we eventually put in place called Teaching Kinesiology in College that a person named Kathy Ennis developed, and I took on later on in my career. But those were some very good ideas of his, like preparing all your slides and then coming in and going, you have no slides. I love it. That's a great idea. But I mean, I think that's something we don't push enough. Jill.
I just thought of something, Phil. This is not a specific study or paper or idea, but it's the thought that one of the things that Michael Turvey also said, or he said to me, that even Esther, who really used these concepts well in explaining some of her work and in designing new experiments, she didn't do equations, as it were, and she had to she was working with Gregor Schoner towards the end of her life, and so my point is that I didn't do equations either. When I was trying to do my dissertation on dynamical systems, I did it with using not even non-linear, but just regular variability measures because it's so far back. But I always regretted not hooking up early enough, or at all, really. I had one effort with somebody who could do the math. And therefore, I think you can get a lot further when you can do a mathematical as well as a sort of conceptual realization of some of these ideas. And I just regret that I didn't do very well. Well, no, I did okay in mathematics, but I didn't have a good colleague to work with on that. And I think that's where a lot of people, I'm going to make a statement now, that maybe a lot of people in motor development don't necessarily want to look at equations a lot, but it would be nice to, work with people who do. And then I think that will move the field forward a bit, in my opinion.
And that was actually Kugler's, yeah, Victor.
just my 2 cents about this aspect. Sorry, let's go this way. Just my 2 cents about how this idea of having equations may help in research. There's if you go back to 1985, you have the HKP model developed by Haken, Kelsen, and Bunce. It's not that complicated equation, but it kind of struggle a little bit at the beginning. But in the 90s, Michael Turvey has a series of studies manipulating some aspects of that equation and showing how bimanual coordination would be affected by those parameters that he was manipulating. So it's not about model development, but I think that they were like Michael Turvey, Nia Amazin, Dagmar Sternert, Paul Treffner, all those papers. They were very clever in a way to manipulate parameters of the equation and show how that would affect and confirm the predictions of the model. So again, it's not about model development, but it's a smart way to start to think about how to use those equations that seems to be very hard at the beginning in your favor. So I think that you may get some good ideas from those papers.
Right. And wasn't the Kugler the modeler for a lot of that before Schooner came into the story, right?
Kugler was the modeler for the 1987 book, that was Kugler's dissertation. So he had a different kind of model in pendulums and bimanual coordination, but the work in the 90s is more based on Kelsen's work. But you can kind of see both how manipulate things and get your predictions from those models.
Right. Well, for the grad students, you have a lot of reading to do. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate my colleague from Brazil. And again, go look at the Brazilian Journal of Motor Behavior. It's a wonderful journal and it's open access. Yes. So contribute something to it. They now do it in English, although I will say that you have to use that old-fashioned AMA style, not APA style of editing. We have the paper completely done, all in APA style. And we send it to him and he says, oh, you have to get it in this other style. And of course, I'm so old and retired that I do not have a reference manager anymore or any of these other programs. So we
Neither
have
of
to
us did.
by hand, one at a time, and make sure that we didn't miss it. I mean, at least we knew how to do that. Please go to APA style. That's my only comment to the journal.
Okay, I'll bring that device forward, okay? I will do
And
it.
tell Barella that too, right?
Yes, I will do.
Okay.
No,
So thank you very
I'm not
much.
necessarily endorsing that one.
All right.
Thank y'all very much. It was really nice.
Yeah. Thanks
Well,
for being here. Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.